I'm being lazy today, just recording this one on my phone, so excuse the shakiness. But I wanted to talk about the whole Xennial thing again. It was about 8 months ago or so that I posted my first Xennial video, and it was actually the first video on my public YouTube channel in, God, I don't even know how long. And at the time that I made that video, I talked about what the concept of a Xennial was, as well as the year ranges, and I even talked about like the concept of like the Nintendo generation and how I felt like there was the Xennial generation, which was like a small cohort, and then there was like the wider sort of Nintendo generation that encompassed like the late 70s to late 80s, whereas like Xennial is like 77 to 83 typically. And I just kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit more, even though I don't have a ton of new things to say about it, but I've noticed that there's a lot of people online, YouTube comments especially, not my video necessarily, but lots of other videos about the subject, where there's a lot of people born in the mid to late 80s, and even like all the way up to like 89 or 90 sometimes, that want to be considered a Xennial, and they don't feel like, and they seem to be very adamant about it, like especially people born in 85. And the only thing I can think of is that they don't like being associated with millennial, because millennial has gotten a lot of kind of a bad rap over the last 10 years or so. Of course, I remember a time when that was different. Around the time, or even slightly before the time that the term millennial was coined, people were singing the praises, like baby boomers and stuff were singing the praises of millennials and talking about how millennials were going to be like these revolutionaries who were going to, like, they were basically like the second coming of Jesus and stuff, like they were going to change the world and things were going to be so amazing. And it seemed like there was a lot of like hype and praise for the upcoming millennial generation, which I was a little too old to be considered part of at the time. And they didn't really coined the term millennial until around the year 2000 or so. Before then, if there was a term at all, it was like Generation Y. And most of the people born the year I was born, 1979, most of my friends, or people born the year after, 1980, grew up pretty much knowing for sure that they were Gen X. It was pretty much instilled in us that we were still Gen X, and our identity is mostly Gen X. And I think that that's true for most Xennials, is that they're sort of generally identified as late Gen Xers, and then a couple years into millennial. And even those millennials don't consider themselves millennials. Most of the time they consider themselves more Gen X. So Xennial, I think, is really a term that fits a very small group of people born from the late 70s to the early 80s, that cusp generation that changes over between Generation X and millennial, where we're just sort of floating in the balance. And we feel like Gen Xers, but we also feel like we missed the boat on core Gen X, which is really sort of late 60s, early to mid 70s at the most, where you get, the core of what's considered in pop culture to be Gen X culture. And so for a lot of us born in the late 70s to early 80s, we generally feel like Gen Xers because we're told we're Gen Xers, and we sort of looked up to Gen Xers, and we grew up with a lot of Gen X culture. But are we Gen Xers? Again, yeah, I guess technically if you're born, 1980 or before, you are, and if you're, born after that, you're a millennial. And I think that that's really where the dividing line kind of falls between the two actual generations. But Xennial isn't really a generation. It's a cohort or a cusp. It's sort of an add-on. It's like you're a Gen Xer but also a Xennial, or a millennial but also a Xennial, if you fall within that 77 to 83 year range. Now, am I willing to die on that hill of that year range? No, because there's so much debate, and there's so many people that seem to have a fit about this or that, and honestly, these year ranges are just kind of pulled out of people's butts. Like, you see one article and it says this, you see another article and it says that, and you see motivational speakers that are pulling out the weirdest year ranges ever. I think they're just making them up, honestly. And it's just kind of all over the place a lot of times. The most common I've seen, though, is 77 to 83, and that seems to fit with the two original articles that sort of coined the term or inspired the coining of the term, which is the Slate article from 2011 and the Good Magazine article from 2014, the latter of which actually coined the term Xennial. When you combine those two articles together, you get a year range of 77 to 83-ish. And so that's where I think most people kind of get the common year range. And I think that that's a pretty good year range. Another way to look at it is to say that if you were in high school with anybody born in 1980, then you're a Xennial. So in other words, if you were born in 77, that means that you were in high school, like a senior in high school, when somebody born in 1980 was a freshman. And if you were born in 1983, then you were a freshman in high school when somebody born in 1980 was a senior. So 1980 becomes sort of the pivot point for Xennial. And I think that that's a pretty good way to look at it. Another way some people look at it is to say that a Xennial is anyone who was born during the original release dates of the original Star Wars trilogy, which is 1977 and 1983. Again, so I think that that's a pretty good year range, and I think that it fits really well. But there's no like standards association or anything for these things, so it's not like it's set in stone. But I do think it fits because, again, it's not meant to be a whole generation like Gen X or Millennial. Again, we are either Gen Xers or we are Millennials, but we are also Xennials if we fit within that small handful of years that is described to be a Xennial. I think the problem is that people are trying to turn this into a full-on generation rather than the micro-generation or cohort that it is. It's really, Xennial is meant to describe a handful of years, people born between a handful of years that experienced a very certain kind of cultural transition period between two major generations, Gen X and Millennial. And when you try to fit somebody in from, say, 1987 with somebody from 1977, you no longer have that cusp micro-generation, that transitionary generation. You're now starting to describe a full generation because that's 10 years. And full generations typically are 15 to 20 years. So you're very close to describing a full generation at that point. And the reality is, how much do people from 1987 and 1977 have in common when it comes to their childhood and their teenage years? I mean, that's 10 years apart. That's a 20-year-old versus a 10-year-old, or an 18-year-old versus an 8-year-old. That's a big difference. And when I personally talk about like the Nintendo generation, I'm talking about a much larger generation of people based on the experience of playing the original NES as a kid, and being born during a time when playing the original NES wasn't a retro thing to do, but was a common thing to do because it was one of the modern systems still at the time. And that can describe a 10-year period of time. But I don't think Xennial is trying to describe a 10 or 15-year entire generation. It's one of those things where people like to argue about it. And I think it's just a lot of disenfranchised core millennials who are trying to fit into a Xennial tag because when they became adults and the term millennial got coined, suddenly it got flipped. They're trying to run away from that term as fast as they can. I get it, but the reality is there's nothing wrong with millennials. Millennials are not bad people. I've known lots of millennials, both older millennials and core millennials, who are good people just trying to get through life, like everybody else. So, stereotypes are stereotypes, whatever, but I don't think there's anything wrong with being a millennial, just like there's nothing wrong with being a Gen Xer. And if you happen to fall within 77 to 83, then you're also a Xennial. So I guess that's really that.